Mary couldn't sit still. With great effort, she rose from the low stool in the courtyard where she and the other women were preparing the evening meal. She placed one hand on her lower back and began to pace back and forth. She felt restless, uneasy. The older women watched her for a moment before casting knowing looks to each other. Mary's baby was ready to make his entrance. As the family sat in a circle on the floor, tearing off pieces of pita bread and scooping up couscous and yogurt from the large communal bowl, Mary sat looking at the piece of bread in her hand. She knew she should be ravenous, but somehow she couldn't eat. She reached up to wipe a trickle of sweat from her temple. The packed room was stifling despite the fact the sun had set long ago. A moment later, Mary gasped as the dull ache in her lower abdomen suddenly intensified. One of Joseph's aunts, seated next to her, frowned, reached out to place a hand on her stomach, and found the muscles clenched tight. "It's time," she said. Joseph leapt to his feet, his face white with alarm. His uncle chuckled, patted him on the shoulder, and sent him off to get the town midwife. As two of the women helped Mary to her feet, the matriarch of the family began barking orders to the rest of the clan. Normally, Mary would have been offered the privacy and comfort of the Cataluma, the guest room, but since the house was full of guests and her labor could possibly stretch into the early hours of the morning, they would need to improvise. Quickly, the animals were evicted from the stables beneath the main living area. The children were tasked with sweeping the area clean and placing fresh straw on the floor. By the time the midwife arrived, Mary was leaning against the cool stone wall of the stables as she waited for the next contraction to pass. The jovial older woman shuffled into the stables, birthing stool hooked over her arm. Joseph peeked anxiously through the doorway at his wife for a moment before one of the women shooed him away upstairs to wait. The moment his foot landed on the first step leading to the main living room, Mary cried out in pain. Joseph froze. Beside him, his uncle laid a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Come, Joseph," he said. "She is in good hands." Hours later, in the dark, early hours of the morning, Mary gasped for air and cried out in pain from the birthing stool, where she leaned back into the supportive arms of Joseph's aunt. The midwife crouched low in front of her, murmuring encouragement. "It's time to push, my daughter," she said. "Be strong now." The next contraction tore through Mary's body only seconds after the last one subsided. Then, with a cry of agony, she bore down with all her remaining strength. The pain faded as her baby's first cry pierced the night. "You have a son," the midwife announced. Upstairs, Joseph's ecstatic shout was joined by the joyful celebration of his uncles and cousins. In the stables below, the midwife tenderly placed the crying baby on his young mother's chest. Tears flowed down Mary's face as she bent to kiss her son's forehead for the first time. Joseph peeked around the corner of the stables. His aunt turned to wave him into the room. "Come," she said. "Come meet your son." Joseph rushed to Mary's side and knelt down to wrap an arm around her. Gently, he placed a calloused hand on the baby's head as he blinked back tears of joy. "Have you chosen a name?" his aunt asked. "Yeshua," Mary said as she gazed tenderly into the eyes of her son, now quiet and alert. "Yeshua. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Father, when the moment was right, you brought your Son into the world. The King of all creation, robed in brilliant light, exchanged his glory for our humanity with all of its frailties, vulnerabilities, and indignities. What a wonder is your salvation. Steadfastly you pursued our redemption across millennia, entrusting flawed men and women to play their part in carrying it ever forward. Then, when it was time, you came. You could have harnessed the wind and ridden its back into our midst. You could have fashioned a chariot of pure starlight for your grand entrance, but you came in the womb of a virgin peasant girl from a small town, and I bow in awe of you. Amen.